Very good. Welcome, everybody. My name's Tom Gash. I'm the Director of Research at the Institute for Government. And thanks for joining us for this event, which is partly one of a series of events we're doing to launch our programme for effective government. We took the programme to party conferences to try and engage with different political groups on what they thought more effective government might look like from 2015. And 6 months out from the election, we want to continue that debate today with representatives from various parts of civil society. Nicola will present the findings of our research, and then we'll hear from three very distinguished people in public life. So we have Gillian Guy, who's the Chief Executive of Citizens Advice and has had a long and distinguished career in public service, also was Chief Executive of Victim Support, and before that worked in local government in various roles. We have Justine Roberts, who's many of you will know, is the founder and CEO of Mumsnet, and prior to that was both a journalist and worked, I think, for a brief time in the city as well. And we have Tim Haynes, who's currently the Director General of the British Private Equity and Venture Capital Association, which oddly has the acronym BVCA, despite having many, many more words in its long name. And as interestingly, I didn't actually know this about Tim, but former lecturer in politics at Oxford University, as well as working for a long time for the Times in various different roles, including chief leader writer. So the rules of engagement for today are that everything that's said will be on the record. We're recording it and we'll put that video up online later. We are also on Twitter, so this is also going to be an event that will be tweeted. The Twitter hashtag there is EffectiveGov, and if you want to engage with the IFG's commentary on it, that's at IFG Events. You can also see our Wi-Fi network and username and password if you want to log into our Wi-Fi system. But before we carry on, I just want to say thanks again for coming and say that this is a chance to open up a debate. So we'll hear from Nicola first on what we think more effective government should look like. But there are obviously many views about that complex issue, and what we really want to see is more people talking about government effectiveness as well as winners and losers in debates on politics. So Nicola, over to you first, and then we'll hear from the three panellists and open it up for questions afterwards.
So hello, I'm Nicola Hughes. I'm a senior researcher here at the Institute. And like most of you, I suspect I'm a bit of a political anorak, so I really love elections, love the gaffes and the debates and the polls and all the gossips. And that's what TV and media is going to be focusing on, I suppose, for the next 6 months. And in between now and May, the parties are going to be focused on their policy, on their campaigns, on what messages they're going to be taking to the doorsteps. But what is often overlooked is not the policies, but actually how governments are going to run. So how are they going to get their policies to work in practice? Now, it should be pretty obvious to politicians why they would want to do that, how to turn their reforms into real outcomes and how to make a difference in government. We also did some polling over the summer which would suggest that this is important to everyday voters as well. So unsurprisingly, the people that we polled had very, very low confidence in politicians' policy pronouncements. They didn't think that politicians knew how they were going to deliver their policies or how they were going to pay for them. But the good news for politicians is that 2/3 of the people we polled said they would be more likely to vote for a party that could show how it would implement its policies in practice. So the IFG has been around for 5 years, and we've built up a lot of evidence about how government works. And before we come onto the panel today, I just want to talk about some of the big challenges that are going to face government after 2015, whichever party or combination of parties gains power. We think that 5 of the big challenges are reducing the deficit, achieving economic growth, tackling long-term and complicated policy challenges, reforming public services, and governing in a world where power is more widely spread. So first of all, reducing the deficit. I think we can all agree that spending in the 2015 Parliament will be tight, so a lot of the easiest cuts to make have already been made. And all the parties are committed to controlling public debt in one way or another, although different ways of going about it. I think this is going to be a key battleground ahead of the next election. So one of the big risks for parties is making commitments before the election that they can't then keep in government. And again, we did some polling on this. So 85% of the people we polled think that parties shouldn't make promises if they're not sure how they're then going to pay for them in government. And a similar proportion thought that government should take the time to get decisions right, to consult widely with experts. What we tend to see there in government is a sort of traditional spending review process to work out budgets. And that usually involves kind of hurried settlements, haggling between the Treasury and departments. And I don't think that's going to cut it this time. What we think we need, as is shown in this chart here, is a longer-term spending review that covers up to 5 years, that builds in more planning at the outset, that incentivises and encourages collaboration between departments so that they're actually working together. And rather than mandating change from Whitehall, allows frontline services to do the process improvements that can make big savings. The other important aspect of the economy is, of course, achieving economic growth. So all the parties want to create growth and to share the benefits of it widely. Again, they have different ways of doing this. Most of the parties are pledging better infrastructure and housing. They're talking about decentralisation, for example, to city mayors. And they're talking about what David Cameron called a sleeves rolled up active industrial strategy. So government has historically struggled to get big infrastructure projects off the ground. If you think of HS2 or airport capacity in the southeast, very often those projects are held back by disputed evidence, by policy instability, and with the public not really being fully on board with them. And that can lead to indecision, to delays, to stuff not getting off the ground. It's quite interesting here, I think, to look at how other countries approach this. What we don't have in the UK is a sort of lasting institution that helps to raise the level of public debate. This example here is from France, the National Commission of Public Debate in France, which sets out the evidence, engages, and as you can see from this process, does a very deep consultation with people around big infrastructure projects to get buy-in and to have a much more open debate about the trade-offs involved. The other thing that parties are talking about, of course, is decentralisation and city mayors and so on. And one thing we would say there is that a general manifesto commitment isn't going to be enough. They need to be quite specific and have a cabinet level agreement on what tax and spend powers they'll decentralise, because history shows that previous attempts at decentralisation haven't quite worked unless parties are clear in advance what they're going to decentralise and how. So, next, we thought about how the next government can tackle complex and long-term policy challenges. So I'm thinking here of things like energy security, demographic change, climate change, these sort of long-term complicated policy issues. And politicians, I think, know that if they don't tackle those sorts of issues early and act in a preventative way, that they might well get crises further down the line and have to do sort of knee-jerk responses, which nobody wants. We also found that there was quite a lot of public support for more long-term thinking. This is one of the polling results that quite surprised me. So about 3/4 of people we surveyed said that they would prefer politicians who are focused on the long term, even if that means getting things done more slowly, to politicians who prioritise responding and reacting to events more quickly. As anyone that's worked in government or politics knows, though, that sort of long-term planning gets squeezed out by day-to-day priorities, by day-to-day politics. So we think the government has to create space to do the long-term thinking. To cite an example of where this has worked, the Pensions Reform Commission, led by Adair Turner, took a really long-term, difficult policy issue. It spent time to gather the evidence on it, to consult widely, to work across departments and to work across parties. And that was really good at engaging people and getting a sort of wider buy-in for a long-term policy problem. I think the other thing that government can do here is not rush to legislation, which is a sort of very typical policy tool, but use other techniques like allowing communities to come up with their own policy solutions, using some of the techniques we know now around behavioural science and policy labs and what works centres, which we think are really good innovations. So schools and hospitals, that's where, of course, the public interacts the most with government. And it's a really tricky area, I think, in 2015. There's going to be less money to spend on public services, but there's also going to be lots of demand. That's not going away. So it's important for politicians to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of public services. Now, a somewhat typical political reaction, if there's a problem in one of those areas, is to do a big structural reform. So this little picture here shows how many reforms we've had in the NHS. Lots of kind of top-down big reforms. We've also seen those, I think, over the last 5 years in welfare and justice. Lots of big changes. I think doing any more in 2015 does carry some risks with it. I mean, these big structural reforms often involve distraction at the front line. They can initially have performance dips involved. So we'd caution politicians to sort of approach those with caution and think about what small frontline process improvements could make a difference rather than just sort of big top-down changes. In the more immediate term, we've got some problems in the outsourcing of public services. So we've had a series of scandals and problems over the last few years
which I think show how some of the issues in government contracting aren't working quite well enough, and we'd like to see more transparency around government contracting and public services, and also a continued drive to improve the skills of the Civil Service Act commissioning and contracting. Finally, whoever wins power is going to be operating in a pretty complicated political environment. First of all, the likelihood of a majority seems increasingly slim. As you can see from this chart, the vote share for the two biggest parties, Labour and Conservative, has been sort of in gradual decline over the last 50 years or so. So we're seeing more smaller parties, more likelihood of multi-party politics. At the same time, I think there's a lot of public scepticism about government, a less differential electorate, a less centralised state. So that means that power is going to be very different. Ministers can't just come in and pull a lever and expect change to happen. Alongside working with other parties, I mean, they'll also have to be working with devolved administrations. Obviously, we've had the referendum this year, local areas, the EU. All of those, I think, mean governing in a different type of way, a way that's more collaborative, more cooperative. Some sensible things that government can do in that, so if you're working with other parties, have protocols for how you're going to work together, how you're going to refresh your plan, how you're going to communicate. And they can also, I think, be more open with the public, get some more data out there about open government, be more transparent, allow the public to scrutinise and help to rebuild some of the trust that's been lost. So that was a brief run through of what we think are 5 really big goals for all parties in 2015. No doubt many of you will have more. But what really comes through is that government has to take governing seriously if it's going to meet those goals, and it has to start preparing soon. The polling that we did over the summer shows that voters really want politicians who are professional, who can show that they can get the job done, who think about the long term, and who will fulfil their promises. But too often what they find they're seeing is politicians who are focused on the short term, who are worried about media announcements and scoring political points against the other party trying to get re-elected. So hopefully the next Parliament will be a chance for politicians to show that they can be more professional and that they can implement their policies to make a big difference. That's it from me, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel's views. Thank you.
Very good. So we're going to go this way down the panel, and I think our panellists are all going to stay seated, but I hope you can all see them and hear them thanks to our excellent mics.
That's my cue.
That's your cue.
Okay, excellent. The first thing I wanted to say is I really welcome this initiative by the Institute for Government, but I would say it's tinged with a bit of disappointment that we have to undertake this kind of research really to come out with some fairly blindingly obvious tips for the next government, and I think that maybe is a point in itself really. From the point of view of citizens' advice, I would say we agree broadly with the findings that have come out, and I guess to some extent who wouldn't, but I suppose we have a slightly different angle on them. So we do think there should be an emphasis on innovation and collaboration, and that's right, but we don't think that stops at eradicating duplication. We still think there is a lot of room for fundamental reform. And the redesign really needs to be embedded in clear implementation and accountability, because so many things get thought about, they get shelved, and they don't actually see their way through. So that's an emphasis for us. We also agree there's a dual agenda going on here, that there's the growth piece and also the deficit reduction, which cannot be ignored. But our big worry is that about 3/4 of the public services expenditure cuts is yet to come. And we're worried that the sitting duck in all of this is the safety net that we provide for our society and for our communities. So we're concerned that we could see billions of pounds still to come out of the welfare budget with devastating consequences. And that's in a situation where, from our point of view, 1 in 4 of our clients are in serious debt. There is, we think, a growth in employment, but it's unstable employment very often, which doesn't give people the security they need. That fuel and food are an ever-increasing proportion of the income that people manage to get in through the door. Energy has gone up by 1/3 since 2010. There is a shortage of affordable housing, and we see a really insufficiently regulated private rented sector, which brought to us between July and September of this year 22,000 people with concerns and issues around their private rental situation. That's a 20% increase in the same period last year, so really a growing problem. We agree there is complex and cross-cutting policy requirements for the next government, but we do want governments to remember that behind complex policies are complex individuals with complex lives, and it's those impacts that we really want to emphasise. We agree a need to improve public services and actually believe that out of all of the austerity that could actually be a benefit and advantage that comes through from that. And we agree that just structural, because they're easy solutions, aren't necessarily the right ones, but we do think that reform and redesign has to happen around the client, around the customer, around the citizen, whichever form of jargon you want to use, but really around the people upon whom they impact. So why is effective government important to charities and to citizens' advice? Well, two main reasons, I suppose. One is there's an increasing reliance on the third sector to actually deliver public services. There is not a capability or a capacity we see so far in government to really commission adequately, to understand those sectors with whom they want to be delivery partners, and that is causing a problem in smooth delivery. The second point is the impact that it has on the citizen, as you might expect me to say. We see face-to-face 2 million people a year. We have about 1.5 million telephone calls with people, and we have about 14 million people come to our website every year. And through all of that, we can probably resolve 2 out of 3 of the issues that come to us. 1 out of 3, though, we cannot get near because they are systemic problems, and those are the things that really government has to tackle particularly. Now, the impact of government policy, I think, can actually be quite perverse in some examples, so just thinking that through. For example, if you want to encourage people and make work pay, encourage people into work, having the counter piece around the cost and lack of flexibility around childcare can completely scupper that as an initiative. I think sometimes we could go even further and say that policy can be almost doomed from the beginning when you start out without thinking about it in the round. So if you're looking to decrease fuel poverty, but you have the massive majority of homes without thermostats and no sort of green initiatives really being joined up with the ability to make a difference to fuel consumption, that really doesn't help the policy. And if you want people to live in accommodation that suits the size of their family, then you've got to have places for them to move to. Otherwise, all you're doing is decreasing their income. And in terms of universal credit, welfare reform has been mentioned. If you want people to have monthly payments into bank accounts, that's going to be scuppered if people can't get a bank account in the first place and if they have no budgeting capability at all. And there are hidden consequences of policy as well. So there's been a tendency to go for black box, as they're called, contracts. So all we're worried about really is the outputs. We're not necessarily worried about how they're achieved or the impact that has on the outcomes. And we've seen that again through welfare reform, work capability assessments and the like. So the challenges, which again we agree with the work that's come out of the Institute, we believe do need some change in the approach to government in order to tackle those. The first thing I'd say is that it needs a rigorous analysis of cumulative impact. Not just single impact of single policies, but really cumulative impact, all consequences of any policy or process change and on people. We also think that the government has to make up its mind about localisation in an emerging context of devolution as well. Is it empowerment and letting go, or is it shifting the burden with strings attached? And those two are completely opposite and will have completely different impact as they go forward. We think that service design, public service design, has to be centred on the client or the citizen in our terms. It has to be genuinely cross-cutting, but there has to be a system of accountability that is also genuinely cost-cutting. So the Public Accounts Committee should not be seeing single issues, but actually across the whole piece of government. We think the next government has to recognise that change is actually about people. It's not about processes. It's not an IT system that suddenly achieves change. People need support to change. They need advice. They need guidance. And that framework needs to be in place right at the beginning. We believe the government has to recognise the need for and the value of that strong safety net and probably remodel our welfare state so that it's a thing that we all value again, don't decry and don't misunderstand, whether that be willful or not. And I was also interested that the poll came forward saying that the public has a desire for those in government to get the facts right, to make some probably quite brave decisions, long-term decisions, and keep promises. And those decisions as well being based on evidence, which we would support. I think that's a recognition of the value and the need for a new brand of political leadership. It's probably not an acknowledgement of the scale of that challenge. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's very useful. Okay, next in line we have Justine. So if you want to share a few thoughts, that would be great.
Thank you. So I'm Justine and I run Mumsnet. I just want to know how many of you have actually ever participated, been on, looked at Mumsnet and know what it is involved? Okay, so a fair few. So you will know, therefore, you people, that there's very little any consensus on anything on Mumsnet. So particularly around, particular policies. But actually there was a surprising amount of consensus when we asked our users, and generally in the sort of 30,000 posts a day that go on government and how ineffectual it is. So I've tried to sort of group that into a set of sort of points that I've been asked to address, and to pick out the sort of policy areas in particular as well, where there was a broad consensus. But Mumsnet has come in all shapes and sizes and political persuasions, so there certainly wasn't agreement on everything. So I was asked, first of all, why is government important to Mumsnet users? And it's blindingly obvious, really. I mean, I think government's important to everyone. It touches everything. It touches education, the economic climate, whether you're working or not working, old or young, whether you are even you're a grandmum or you're still waiting to conceive. But there is a feeling, I think, that women, particularly mothers, probably have borne the brunt of the cuts that have gone on. In fact, there is a lot of evidence that suggests that women have bear the brunt of the cuts, not least because there are so many women who are public sector workers. There is a very strong feeling on Mumsnet, which backs up your report actually, that policy decisions are not long-term, that politicians are interested in short-term gains. They're actually, it's really evidenced on Mumsnet, and indeed Grandsnet, we run that too. Throughout the 5 years of Parliament, we get calls every now and then from various ministries saying, can we come on and talk about this policy? But in the 6 months before an election, we are bombarded with unbelievable amounts of policies and promises. The last election was actually the Times coined a phrase called the Mumsnet election. We had 12 senior ministers, all the leaders included on that, come on Mumsnet, of which we only invited 2. 10 invited themselves. The 2 we invited were for some kind of balance. So that rightly, I think, people have a view that politicians are mostly interested in getting elected, which of course means long-term difficult policy decisions get ignored. And I think anything that can be done to force them into something which they won't naturally do here for the benefit of all of us would be great. Our users, obviously, they want honesty, they want manifesto promises that are realistic, and they want them fully costed. And crucially, they want this evidence-based policy making. So the idea of getting non-aligned experts in a room to help with providing evidence-based solutions which are long-term is something that I think most people on Mumsnet would fully support. The other thing I'd say is there is a very strong feeling that the nature of our politics causes endless tinkering with systems. So again, as mentioned in your report, let's come in and reform it all and start again and tear it up. And in fact, what really matters to people, if you think about people's frustration with anything to do with government, be it local government, national government, your heart sinks every time you have to go near the HMRC website. It's just dealing with any kind of housing issue with local government. It's just disastrous. Now, I've just used my bank app. Lloyds Bank have got an app to pay, some money I owed some people, quite a lot of money to various different people. It took me 3 minutes, I think, to make those payments. I mean, there is a range of solutions in terms of technology that are really out there for government to use just to make it a more user-friendly experience. The amount of frustration in having to deal with just getting what is rightfully yours, really. And when it comes to areas like getting your child statemented or maternity allowance, if anyone tried to get that, if you're self-employed, my God, it's a nightmare. So there is a strong feeling to stop making new policy and make existing policy work really well. You focus on the user experience. I mean, in terms of the tech world, it means doing things like making minimum viable products and testing your hypothesis on a group of users before you make a great big website that takes 2 years and nobody uses. So there's lessons to be learned from the tech startup community and dealing with things in an agile way and using technology to simplify everything for everyone, which I think there's a huge win in there. The other thing is IT folks, I genuinely mean this, they don't tend to be mercenary. They're not like hedge fund guys. If you gave them a really difficult problem, they will work for you if you empower them to really bring solutions. So there's a real opportunity there, I think. In terms of priorities, we were also asked to try and, out of this sort of mass of disagreement that is Mumsnet, to come out with some sort of consensus on what people thought the priorities were. Well, we did actually do a census, and we had 6,000 responses last year to this, and you wouldn't be surprised to know that schools, the NHS and the economy, stroke the cost of living were the big three things. But recently, I would say, and this is partly anecdotally, but also just doing a little bit of qualitative analysis of our boards. A few other things have popped up. I think there is a real concern about inequality, again highlighted in your report. The number of people using food banks and this general assertion, I think, that people are saying more and more, which is you no longer having a job no longer ensures you're not living in poverty, and that sense of actually the working amongst us that are still not guaranteed not to be needing food banks is something that is really shocking, I think, to people and is discussed more and more and more. Housing, which Gillian mentioned, it comes up again and again and again. It's something that clearly needs a long-term, unpopular solution that I don't think any political party is grappling with at the moment. The cost of housing, both the rental market and the buying market, is prohibitive to many. It basically needs someone to say, we need to cause house prices to drop. Now, I don't know which political party is going to put that in their manifesto, but it seems absolutely right for the type of taking it out of the hands of, a sort of bias group of politicians and putting it into something like, one of these French organisations that we've been looking at. In the same way that when the Bank of England was given its independence, so they can actually come up with a set of solutions that address a problem that politically probably is untenable. And the other one is mental health provision, which particularly for the young, where there is a very strong feeling on our boards that actually, because there is so little preventative care and that service is kind of collapsing, that it causes extremely long-term problems and costs much more to the state in the long term. So just to summarise, in a much less eloquent way, I think, than Gillian, I think the message we get is stop reforming and changing and just make the existing system work better and deal with the really untenable political stuff by taking it out of government's hands altogether. Thank you.
Fantastic. Tim?
Thank you, John. I gather I've been invited to be the voice of business, but as you pointed out, I've been an academic, I've been a journalist, I've been a special advisor at the House of Commons, and I run a trade body, so arguably the notion of myself as a kind of hands-on voice of business is mildly fraudulent. But as the first Mayor Daley of Chicago would have put it, what's mild fraudulent amongst friends? So don't worry about it. And if business were it were slightly more sort of plausibly represented here on stage, it's quite easy to predict what it would say. What business wants is something it can't have, which is essentially depoliticised politics. What business wants is long-term planning. What business wants is certainty and stability on questions of tax in particular, and regulation. So what business wants, what business would like would be for the Chancellor to make 2 budgets per Parliament rather than 2 budgets per year. And they can't have any of that. That's the brutal truth. I once had a very, very articulate, very intelligent member of a private equity firm say to me, Tim, why can't British politics be more like post-war German politics? To which the answer is, in order to get post-war German politics, you have to have pre-war German politics, and indeed the war. And do you really want that as a trade-off? And the answer was no, I put it that way. And I say this because if my members were here on stage, and there wouldn't be much room for anyone else if they were, but I mean, they cheer Nicola to the hilt. But they'd be cheering her for the sort of reasons, in a way, the sort of wrong reasons, because her presentation is almost unanswerable. In the way that the Ten Commandments are almost unanswerable. I mean, over the years, the anti-adultery stuff's been proved to be difficult to enforce from time to time. But on the whole, kind of 10 Commandments, you have to tick. The issue isn't the commandments. The issue is how to get people to live by them. All of this is perfectly sensible stuff. The issue is how to get people to live by them. And I think if you're more politically realistic, and this is where I sort of depart from my business sort of brief. I think you need to go further and ask yourself, what is it that we really think the British government does badly compared to governments elsewhere? Because Britain is not actually unique in having political politics, rather than apolitical politics. And that is, I have to break it to you, the norm. The Germans are the exception, everyone else is the rules. I mean, there used to be a case that, is Peter still in the room, Peter Riddle? He may recall that David Owen used to argue that the first thing he'd do if elected would be to send the carpenters into the House of Commons, because it was all the fault of the layout of the House of Commons that our politics was adversarial. Those of us who are veterans to watching on YouTube scenes of punch-ups in parliaments around the world notice that they occur in semicircular parliaments as well as those with two lines across, and ditto, it's in fault the electoral system. Well, no, you can have very polarised politics under all sorts of electoral systems. So I'm reluctant to argue that those are the kind of the things that we really do badly by comparative circumstances. I think we do three things very badly, and this is my message, bouncing off what Nicola said. First is we are appallingly bad at institutional communications between political parties. Lord Adonis, our mutual friend, tells this wonderful story of when he was pursuing HS2. And he knew that there was absolutely no point spending a lot of public money on this if the Tories were going to dump it, or so reform it that it made no sense whatsoever. So he wanted to talk to David Cameron about it. You thought straightforward, wouldn't you? Under the British system, not straightforward. Cameron's people would not allow Cameron to go to the Department of Transport. Number 10, Andrew himself would have willingly gone to Cameron's office in the House of Commons. So no way on God's earth. That appears that you're conceding we're going to lose the election, and you're consulting him on how this scheme lasts beyond the election. No way, Jose. And Andrew thought of various wild and wonderful schemes about trying to find a mutual friends. They could sort of bump into each other at a cocktail party. All this is absolutely kosher. It's such what the British government. And in the end, what Andrew alighted upon by sheer fluke was he noticed in his sort of list of invitations of things would the minister like to do, an invitation to open or reopen the newly refurbished Whitney railway station. And having ascertained that the local member would also be at said gig, he said, yes, of course I'll do it. And so he turns up, he gets hold of David Cameron 10 minutes early, more or less bundles him into the newly repainted waiting room, literally takes out a map of the route of High Speed 2 and says that, look, take this away, and by some means or another, let me know if you can live with it. And that is the sophistication with which cross-party dialogue occurs in the United Kingdom. And so we have this irony that the vast majority of our politicians are drawn from an incredibly small pool. People who read PPE in Oxford between roughly 1983 and 1992, and they all knew each other from those times. And so you have Jeremy Hunt, Morden 1984, appoints Simon Stevens Bailey in 1985, to be chief executive of the NHS. So they're an incredibly small set, and yet we lack the institutional means of talking to each other. And I think one of the great roles for this great body, the Institute, going forwards, is to become ever more of a sort of safe house where this sort of conversation occurs, because the only way that maybe it does occur is either by accident, or when the two parties find themselves in an embarrassing position, they think their policies are going to converge on a position, but it might not be popular with someone. We go through the expensive charade of an expert commission in order to give them both the alibi in order to jump in the same direction. So the Adair Turner's great work was referred to earlier. The sole point of that was in order to give both political parties an alibi to say the retirement age has to raise. That was the politics of it. But neither of them wanted to jump first and say, we're in favour of making it work for longer, in case the other one opposed it. and sort of got votes for doing so. Ditto, we all know the Davis Commission is a high-class farce. Both political parties need to get themselves off the hook of no more airport capacity in South East England. None of them wants to go first in admitting we can't sort of wrong on that thing. So you have to bring in an expert commission to come out with a result, which they both say, oh, well, we never knew that evidence existed. And we go ahead. So we're very, very bad at institutional communication as a country. I think that's true in comparative terms. Secondly, and it's been touched on very, very well beforehand, so I won't last, I think infrastructure is a genuine case of the same. Now, in fairness, there are challenges for infrastructure in the UK which are different to those of France and Germany and Australia, which are held out to be the market leaders. Population density and where the population is distributed in the UK means it's quite hard to build a bloody railway from A to B, as you can do in France, and have only about 8 people aggrieved. It is much, much harder, but nevertheless, I do think there is hard evidence that infrastructure has been rather messed up over the last century, really, in the UK. And I think something around the notion that Labour is pushing around the sort of notion of a National Infrastructure Commission and the John Arnott model, where basically Parliament vetoes schemes rather than proposes them. There is some real merit in that, and I think we do genuinely do that badly by international standards. And thirdly, and here I'm less sure of my fact on international circumstances, but I think we're getting comparative perspective, and it was touched on next to me, is the whole question of adapting to the digital revolution and bringing government into the internet age. If you think of not 2 sectors but 3, the personal sector, that's you as an individual, the private sector and the public sector, who has genuinely adapted to new technology best, fastest, most efficiently? Actually, on the whole, it's the personal sector. It's individuals. So many of our fellow citizens have proved very, very adept at adapting to new technology very quickly and are very comfortable users of it and have transformed their lives through it in a way that can't be said either the private sector or the public sector uniformly has transformed their lives by doing it. So I give you the gold medal. Silver medal goes to the best of the private sector, and bronze medal on the whole goes to the public sector. And why do I think it's in that order? What I think the magic thing there is, it's all about flat management structures. You're an extremely flat management structure. You're yourself. There's no complicated set of stakeholders to engage with, and there's nobody older than you to take the idea to and then going, oh, I've never done that. Apps, God, forget it. They'll never catch on. I was at Oxford University in 1983 when the university managed to produce a report that said that word processors would never overtake the typewriter. I kid you not. The best of the private sector have what's the absolute determinants as to who gets technology first. It is the nature of the management structure. The reason why Next have kicked M&S over the park is that Next looks like the Israeli army and the M&S is organised like the British army. It is extremely flat management structure. Sam Wolfson, maybe the front man, and the rest of it. If you're a bright 25-year-old at Next, you can get the chief executive's ear in a way that's completely impossible at Marks and Spencer's to do so. So it's all, and that to my mind, my biggest single crusade, if I were doing Peter's job, and it's a very, very hard one, the civil service, is that there's a fundamental problem. If you look at the private sector, for any kind of analogy, the more hierarchical your management structure, the less good you are at adapting to change, particularly completely new, innovative change. So those are my that's the kind of end of the sermon. Those are 3 things I think we do genuinely badly. But I do think there's actually quite a role in all 3 of these things for bodies such as this, which is very unusual in the UK. Before it came along, there was really nothing like it. To actually be the engine for a serious debate about how do we get politicians to talk to each other on neutral ground without it seeming like a betrayal, the very idea of a dialogue. How do we kind of neutralise infrastructure as a question? And then how do we foster flat management structures that will instinctively adopt new technologies rather than just reluctantly do so after everyone else has done it?
Fantastic, that's incredibly helpful. I'm going to abuse the chair for a second and ask a couple of probing questions, I hope. The first is, you've talked a lot, I think, about examples of where policy makings or decisions haven't worked, but have you been involved in any processes where you've been given good hints, at least, of what a good government policy making process might look like, and what are the ingredients of good policy making from your different perspectives? Oh, that's quite a hard question. I can tell I've asked the tricky one. But any thoughts on that?
I'll have a go at that. I mean, I think it's the converse of what I was describing, really, which I have had some experience of, and that's that policy starts with discussions with people, and those people who will be impacted by it, and organisations representing those people, that it builds and changes and adapts as that goes forward, that there's a clear line as to who's going to implement following the development of that policy, and there's some clear accountability for it. And those things often are lacking, but where they are in sequence, and I think just playing into the hierarchical point, they often are more effective when it's not about hierarchy, it's actually about who wants to get something done, and you get them in a room and you start talking about it. And that, for us, has certainly worked in the past in a number of instances, but there are many more where it hasn't.
Another question, you can come back on that if you want as well, but there's a sort of contradiction going on, I think, in some of our polling and in some of the things that people say, and then the reality of how the world works. So if everyone we're speaking to say we want politicians who get things done, who think about long-term decision making, who don't do political point scoring and so forth, then why is it that then political parties clearly see that there is still an advantage in short-term politics, tokenistic announcements that might not necessarily go anywhere, and adversarial styles of politics which can lead to all sorts of inefficiency, delay, rather than building consensus and long-term thinking? So how do any of you explain that sort of contradiction between what people say they'd like and then obviously the system we've got that seems to not suggest that people work in that way?
Well, one thing I would say is that the other bit of evidence is everyone is very disillusioned with politics and politicians. So apparently 60% of Mumsnetters have yet to decide who to vote for. And I think, I mean, I hesitate to say this because you might take it the wrong way, but of the leaders, the one with the least bad net approval rating, and they were all in negative territory, was Nigel Farage. You know, so I think I can't actually give you the answer as to why no one stepped into the void, but I can tell you there is a void, and definitely people are very, very, you know, disillusioned and cross. I don't know whether it's something to do with our media. It's the same thing as to why don't politicians communicate properly with each other in this country? Why are we much worse than other countries when, as you said, they all went to university together? You know, is it something to do with the media? Is it? I don't know. Well, I'd be interested to know what the audience think about that.
I think part of the answer to the question is that the public are answering these questions in a slightly more idealistic fashion than I suspect. If you were to force them into a sort of war gaming scenario and said, look, you know, you're now X, you're not a member of the public, you're now a politician. So you've got all sorts of other different constituencies besides the righteous common good to contemplate. I think people might actually kind of shift around a bit when confronted with those realities. And as I say, with the exception of the saintly Germans, I don't think actually, putting to one side the 3 points I've made, we are that different. I mean, you know, it was historically argued that American political parties were much looser than ours. That's obviously about history, but the notion that in the United States you don't have blinkered partisan politics is kind of absolutely laughable. It's actually arguably, I would say now, worse in the US than it is in most European countries.
Very good. I'll go to the floor now. Oh yeah, of course.
I just want to add a couple of things maybe to throw into the discussion. I think we confuse politics with political leadership by and large, and actually, yeah, you have to be quite brave, I think, to be a political leader, because you have to make some unpopular decisions around things. There has to be an argument, I think, that sometimes we get the politicians we deserve. It is all very short-termist. That's our electoral process. We seem to be veering towards whoever gets the most colourful tie and can cheer everybody up on television debates actually is the appropriate leader, and I think that explains some of our opinion polls. And actually the media have a complete fest when anything fairly trivial goes wrong and they go for it, and that's the kind of way we judge people. So we've built up a system that actually gives us that kind of political situation and actually takes away from people wanting to be brave and wanting to be political leaders. I know people who've gone out of politics because they just can't stand it anymore, because it isn't purist, it isn't about ideology, it's actually about how can you dodge the media and the public gaze.
We should also, this might sound heresy at the Institute of Government, we shouldn't overstress the importance of politics in life. I was recently asked to do a funny little survey, which at the time I thought was bonkers, but it's actually quite useful. I was asked to name the panel survey, the 5 most important Americans of the last 40 years. I sat down and thought about it and wrote my 5, and only one of them was a politician, Ronald Reagan. The other 4 were all in the tech space: Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, and Larry.
They're all political.
Yeah, but they're not politicians, because technology has more transformed most people's lives than even a quite successful cabinet minister in a portfolio can.
I want to open this up to the audience now. Questions and thoughts and ideas. Can we keep them quite concise if possible? I'll take 3 questions. Can you please all say who you are and, if relevant, what organisation you come from? And then I'll put those back to whichever of our panellists is most interested in asking them. So can I take Mark, and I think Mark as well, actually? And then
Thanks. Mark Darcy from BBC News. A lot of you talked about sort of breaking down the various problems the next government will face into bite-sized chunks. My point is that there are going to be rather a lot of them. The next government is going to have to simultaneously rethink our relationship with the EU, rethink the internal workings of the UK itself, deal with austerity, which has sort of subsets like trivial issues like a new model of sustainable funding for the NHS and the like. And it's probably going to be a fantastically weak majority, or more likely a rather messy coalition or minority government trying to do all this. My question is, how on earth do you do all that at once? Because you have to.
very good. Next there, and then there's one more at the back, Lauren, as well.
Thank you. Mark Sanford from the House of Commons Library. I noticed that the 3 panel members made almost no mention of localism, whatever we mean exactly by that. But I wanted to ask what would you see the value being that localisation of public services, however you define it, adds to the business of good government? What are the main advantages and disadvantages that are obvious at this stage?
Yes, hello, Joe Dilger, educational governance consultant and former civil servant. My question revolves around, do the panel think we prepare our members of parliament well enough to be effective ministers? To briefly draw an analogy, most schools would expect a head teacher or potential head teacher now to have done the NPQH, the National Professional Qualification for head teachers, to oversee and spend with the staff a budget of, say, £5 or £10 million for a big primary or secondary school, but we don't necessarily expect ministers to have completed any qualification to oversee a health or education budget running to billions of pounds. Thank you.
Good question. Let's just take one more question from the back there as well.
Thanks. Alice Robbins, I'm in the policy team at PwC. I had a question about sort of moving towards the practicalities of how you would get people engaged beyond the sometimes salacious and superficial short-termism that's perhaps fueled by the media. So how do you get people engaged with those topics that clearly they do really care about? And particularly I'd be interested in the sort of younger person perspective. Like Mumsnet is a great forum for people talking about topics, but is there a role for social media of getting more discussion about policy rather than politics?
Okay, fantastic. So we've got a good range of questions there. So I think Mark's question was probably, how do you eat an elephant? The second question, I think, was around localism and good government. The third was around preparation of our political leaders. And then the fourth there around public engagement and engaging in these sort of knotty issues. What I'll ask is if people could just pick the ones they want to answer effectively, and probably pick one each, but maybe 2 if you're feeling particularly greedy. I prefer to start with this
question about MPs and how suitable that is as training for them for becoming ministers, because this is one of the other things that we do at the Institute, which isn't a very widely done thing. Being a minister is a challenging role, undoubtedly. You know, you have to look after your department and, you know, you're essentially running a big organisation, which many of them have never done before. You've also got to deal with Parliament, you've got to be a good policy maker, you've got to be a good communicator. It is a really challenging role, and I think a lot of MPs therefore think it's a unique role and nothing can prepare you for that job. I think that when you compare that to, say, chief executives of big companies, it would be unthinkable for them not to do sort of coaching, training and development, to reflect on their performance, those sorts of things. Ministers don't tend to do that at the moment. It's not a very culturally widely done thing, but I think we are starting to see more ministers and more of the people around them, so special advisors, thinking, actually, no, I do need a bit of induction. I need to know, you know, what my department's like and how to run it, and I do need a bit of training, and I do need time to get feedback of colleagues and reflect on my performance. And so you know, it's something that we're doing as an institute to try and develop that more. It's not very widely done at the moment, but we would like to see more of it, and I think it's a really good idea.
Very good. Anyone else? Should we come down the panel?
Yeah. I'll try and answer Mark's question, and this because, in a sense, this is an area I know which Institute is focusing on, and I think the institution is right to say that less of the same is not the answer. That the whole approach to reconsidering the role of public spending, the role of the state, has to be, if it's going to be truly effective, has to be willing to think about new models of delivering services, which is why, to my mind, the ability or not of the public sector to adapt quickly to and imaginatively to advance in technology is such a fundamental question. I mean, I know that HMD is very proud of digital.gov and all the rest of it. I mean, man, that came 10 years after other people have been in similar space. So I think that is the real kind of imperative, and I think that links to the localism question, because if all we're going to do is less of the same, put in more branch offices, I don't see any reason why that should improve things. So if localism, if localism can offer flatter management structures and hence more imaginative public sector thinking than centralism can, then put me in the localist camp, double tick. Unless you can provide me with that evidence, I don't see per se why there's any magic wand that says localism will do this thing better than centralism. And finally, on the question of MPs, again, I think we have to think comparatively. It's very easy to sort of say, oh, our MPs are idiots and they're not properly trained for it and all the rest of it. Well, do we really think that's the overseas? In order to enter the sort of Belgian cabinet, you have to sort of pass an exam in public policy competence. No, you do not. And insofar as there might be some sort of answer to that question, it would probably involve introducing more elitism. And I'm not sure the public are going to signing up for that.
Very good. Justine.
So just on the localism one, you asked for examples where it may or may not be working. I mean, we have some examples of a frustration actually with devolvement to local government. We are campaigning for better miscarriage care, and all the parties actually have made very warm noises about supporting it, but a couple of very senior ministers have actually said to me, oh, but it's NHS, that's all local. We actually have no power over that. It's like, well, what's the point of government then, really? And then equally in respite care, where David Cameron, as a result of public pressure, promised £20 million for respite care for people who had kids with special needs so they could get away for a bit, but didn't ring fence it. So what happened was, in many areas locally, that money got sucked into other areas. So, and again, no central power to be able to control that. So a frustration sometimes with local government is what we see. If it means that national government just can wipe their hands of the issue and say, well, not our territory actually. And then the other one on engagement, which I thought probably I should try and attempt to answer. Another one, mums letters are quite young mums. We've got some young mums, 25 to 45. But also I think it's beholden on politicians, on policymakers, on special advisors, on everyone to go out there and engage in the medium where people are. So if that means going and chatting on Snapchat, that's what they should do. And I think, or if it means making certain policies in a BuzzFeed style and sending them out there and getting a reaction, then I think they should do it. Now, I know, again, our lovely media would have great fun lampooning some of that, but actually, how else do you get to young people? Because that's where they're discussing stuff. So, yes, but, coming on Mumsnet is one thing. But actually you've got to get to all channels via all mediums, and you have to be prepared to actually have a discussion and not a broadcast as well.
Gillian.
I think that probably leaves me with the do-it-all question, which is not necessarily the one I particularly favour, but I think actually all the questions are linked, as they should be in this kind of debate. Frankly, my immediate answer on there are so many things, how do you expect anyone to do it, is that's government, and that's quite tough. And that's why you need things like localism, and you need things like an effective civil service. So I think we all suffer in our own organisations for too many things going on at once. You have to moderate how you're going to do it. You have to make sure you devolve appropriately. You have to make sure you engage appropriately, so you've got the spread really of the burden a bit. I think devolving and localism come into the how do you make it doable to some extent. Localism I did mention in my opening because I think it can either be the worst thing ever or it could actually be an answer, and it depends how you view it. If you're dumping stuff locally, it's going to be terrible. Some of that has happened, council tax for example. But if you are going to actually engage, and that's where it comes into the discussion as well, with local communities and give them some power to decide where their priorities are, because one size doesn't fit all, I think you do end up with better engagement, but also a bit of a dilution of what has to be tackled. And I think in terms of the politicians and all the techniques that we have for people, they are supposed to come in and provide something quite different in terms of their policy, and that's what they're voted for. It's not because they're good chief execs of multinationals, but they are supposed to have a civil service that supports them and supports that policy. And I think until we've got proper reform of the civil service, and I'm still waiting for a government that's up for this, to actually say this is a band of people who actually implement policy as opposed to find all the ways in which it is not implementable. And I say that from an organisation trying to relate to government where it is very difficult. And people are rewarded and incentivised to do that as opposed to find all the problems with it, then it is going to be really difficult to tackle.
Very good. Resonates with some of our ideas about being much clearer about responsibilities of senior civil servants vis-a-vis the political leaders we have as well, and being much clearer about those responsibilities and accountabilities. Can we get some more questions? There's one, two. There's two there already, so I'm sure a third. If you're a third hand, you're pretty much sure to get in. There you go. Oh, there's four now. See, they'll come.
Hartley Miller, Chester University Business School. One of the things which seems to be happening over the years is an increasing use of other non-government organisations to deliver the things that government wants to happen. And that ranges on the one hand from bringing in, well, big society was mentioned at a certain stage. We don't hear it so much, but it is increasingly the case that civil society organisations are used for delivery of services. That carries certain risks of them becoming almost captive, but also services are thought to be better delivered by private sector organisations, by associations. They're all being brought in. My question to the panel really is, how far can the work of government be carried out through other organisations, and how far should it?
Very good.
James Sandbach from the Legal Action Group and the Law Commission. There's been a sort of political row this week about the ambit of judicial review. And I think this is, the role actually of the legal system, the judiciary in this is another element. And quite often when, I think one of the things you've had with the coalition agreement, and the problem of agreements between parties, is sometimes they're talked of as if they have a contractual status. In fact, the coalition agreement has no contractual status at all, and there's been lots of claims of kind of bad faith on the other side for things not being implemented and within the coalition agreement. And I'm sure the same would be true within any kind of programme of government that's set out at the beginning of a 5-year parliament. I just wanted to ask the panel what their views were on what the function is of kind of judicial legal oversight, also as a mechanism for resolving disputes as well, where they arise.
Good question. One there, and then I'm going to go back to the lady with the red hair.
Okay. Bruce Lloyd from London South Bank University. Partly following on from the earlier question a minute ago, and underlying a lot of the comments, I wonder whether there is sufficient discussion of the fundamental question about how governments add value to society, and whether or not a lot of the issues around effective government need to start with trying to address that question.
Very good. Have we got one more question back there?
I'm just wondering if the panel thinks that there is structural or modernisation to the political system or the
party system that could help get more people into politics and people more engaged in politics beyond what you've already described in terms of parties speaking to each other over problems.
Very good. Another broad-ranging set of questions there for you to pick off. We have one on commissioning and the role of the state vis-à-vis private and voluntary sectors. We have one around the role of the judicial and legal oversight in promoting effective government. Another about whether we should be better off starting with thinking about how government adds value to start thinking about effectiveness, and then they're about reform of the party system to improve engagement as well. So pick them off as you like. Should we go the other way round so that we don't leave you stuck with a question that you don't necessarily want?
I feel it's incumbent upon me really to talk about the big society and voluntary sector particularly, and other sectors picking up service delivery, because as an organisation we don't set our face against doing that, and indeed we'll be part of the delivery on the pension guidance guarantee and want to be part of that. The decision for us as an organisation is really who's best to deliver something and does it compromise our values, and that's principally where the decision comes. But I think we're probably wrong to start with the premise that government is the best delivery agent. That isn't borne out, I think, by a lot of experience, and actually it is good to look at where other organisations, other sectors might be better at performing that delivery. But as I say, there are set parameters for us about who we are, our independence, our impartiality, and making sure that we are true to our values, and that's how we come to those kind of decisions. I just wanted to make a point about government and just mentioning in passing really that we're talking about central government as we talk about it because we're facing an election, but the whole system of local government is really important to what value does it add, and how is the accountability that is, I think, the unique piece around a democratic situation, democratic setup is really going to add value. And the one thing that we do have is the ability to actually disapprove of something and try and change it. But I think local also offers a lot in terms of engaging people and getting them involved in a debate that touches upon their lives as opposed to what they might read in the media.
Very good.
Just very quickly on the procurement outsourcing of government stuff, I have to declare a sort of bit of history in that Mumsnet has tried to get several government contracts to do things and failed miserably every time, so call me bitter and twisted if you will, but I have to say I think whilst you would naturally think that things should be outsourced to third sector organisations, because how could government possibly be able to do it as well as specialists, the process is so entrepreneurial, and the restraints on choice and the risk averseness of the choice, I think, means that it rules out any efficiency you would save by outsourcing. So just very quickly, I mean, when we have to fill in these forms, you know, they are so prescriptive that actually no one's really looking at outcomes here. What they're looking at is how well you fill in these 150 words in each bit of the form. We failed a couple of times simply because we'd never had a government contract before. I just think everyone in the process is so terrified of making a mistake that they act in the opposite of an entrepreneurial way, and we end up with a worse solution than probably government doing it itself. So there we are. That's my view on that. In terms of modernising the political system, I think there is a real problem generally in that most normal people would you know, rather cut off their own arm than become a politician. And rightly so, if you think about it. I mean, the way that they are held in general disregard, the general scrutiny, I mean, most of us actually would just fail on the test of you know, if the Daily Mail wanted to, they would find something in our closet that would, you know, just mean we'd have to resign instantly. So I think it needs modernising in all sorts of ways, because actually it's so off-putting to ordinary people to get involved. I think there's women shy away because it's so the media scrutiny is so unpleasant, the politics are so adversarial, the whole way you know, government debates, PMQs, all that stuff is done, I think, is really off-putting. And therefore I haven't got a whole set of solutions. There are a number of things recommended by the Hansard Society around that. We've done our own polling of MPs. 80% of them think Parliament's incredibly unfamily friendly. You know, I think it wholesale should be looked at. And again, you might say it's not better anywhere else. I don't know about that, but I mean, it's certainly off-putting to general members of the public.
Very good. Yeah, I think I'm going to agree, but in a slightly kind of using different vocabulary. But I am emphatically not in the camp that says public sector bad, private sector good, or government bad, business good. As I alluded to, I am in the camp that says flat management structures good, hierarchical management is bad, wherever you find them. And the reason why so many governments and private sort of contractual relationships, outsourcing, have been such a bloody disaster, if we're candid, is that government looks for its private sector mirror image as its partner. Hence that phrase, no one ever got fired for hiring IBM. Man, you should not be hiring IBM. If you want revolutionary new tech in government, IBM is the worst place to go within the new tech sector. Go to Tech City and find somebody with 4 employees. That's more likely to find genuinely new, brilliant, innovative ideas. And that is, to my mind, the history, whether it be G4 security, Olympics, the rest of it, it is this inability to break out a mindset that basically hierarchical organisations are ossified. They're not very good at change. And that is my kind of plea and my motto. The coalition agreement was referred to earlier. One of the things that's going to be massively missed was there was a commitment in the coalition agreement that government procurement the government should ensure that by the end of this Parliament, 25% of all government procurement should go to small and medium-sized enterprises. Well, even after year 1, they forced it down to including the supply chain. So if you've got anyone somewhere with a small and medium-sized enterprise, because they couldn't crack the mentality. But I tell you, if anyone here is involved in government and wants a series of ideas which aren't immediately about government, but which are portable, and if you want to be 5 years ahead of the curve, leave this room, go on the Jubilee line to a place called Level 39 at Canary Wharf, which is the headquarters of the fintech sector in London, where there is stuff going on there about how to revolutionise banking that people like my friend here will be happy early adopters for in 18 months' time when it comes out. They'll take government 5 years to know it exists. But they're full of small companies, and it involves the bravery that says, you can do that. And what's really lamentably sad is the single worst offender in this regard is the National Health Service. Now, I was at the event last night with a guy called Dr. Andy Richards, who is a brilliant Cambridge doctor, serial entrepreneur and investor in the medtech sector. Absolutely brilliant. And one of the things he said was, if you want a successful business, the business plans I reject are the first reading is anyone who says the customer base for this new product will be the NHS, because that's so laughably implausible. Well, something he invested in recently, which is a brilliant new artificial heart pump, is being sold to multiple national health services around the world. They haven't even put the NHS on the list. Who do you ring? Who do you talk to? Who's Mr. NHS procurement? How do you get it adopted? How do you deal with the conservatism of GPs as much as anything else? That is absolutely tragic, but it's absolutely true. Don't go to any of my VC members in life science if you have a brilliant medical idea and say, here's the idea and the customer's going to be the NHS. They will laugh in your face.
Nicola, any of those questions appeal to you?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's beholden on me to point to the work that we've done on outsourcing, which is all available on our website. So we've done a lot of research into public service markets and how actually the government probably needs to slow down a little bit on some of these outsourcing deals until some of the problems that have come up along the panel have been ironed out. So I would urge anyone that's interested to have a look at that. I just wanted to come back to the question around the sort of judicial review and contractual status around coalition agreements. And it's really interesting sort of when you look at parties working together, or indeed perm secs and ministers working together, those are so relational, so it's all about how good is the relationship between those people. And so when we think back to the Rose Garden and Clegg and Cameron and everything was all rosy, that's the time, funnily enough, when their relationship's good, that actually you need to sort of nail down a protocol and go, okay, well, if and when, and it's probably more of a when, our parties do start to drift, or we do start falling out or disagreeing about things, how are we going to act around that, and how are we going to resolve disputes between us? An agreement should not just set out these are what our big policy priorities are, but also how are we going to work together. So how am I going to communicate with you what policies I'm announcing and when? How am I going to bring you in? How are we going to speak to each other? And as you said, crucially, what do we do if things go wrong? In terms of adding more kind of legal weight to that, it's not something I've really thought about, but I mean, my first hunch would be. I'm not sure who would sort of be the adjudicator, but I do think it's important for civil servants to be involved in, and knowing what the agreement is between the parties and helping to oversee that where it's appropriate to do so.
Very good. There's a question I want to come back on, which is just, I think, emerged from that discussion, which is about risk aversion. So on the one hand, I think what we see in our work is actually huge willingness to embrace massive risk on the part of government. If you think about some of the reform programmes that have been launched in recent years, I mean, we're talking about outsourcing, so probation reforms, we've just outsourced the whole of the probation service. We did it in the space of about 18 months. There are no existing providers of probation services in the private sector, but we seem to have commissioned it to a French catering company and a couple of other people. So that we in some ways, we embrace huge amounts of risk. So this idea of government as risk averse doesn't seem to quite connect with a lot of the things that we see. But on the other hand, as you say, in lots of small areas, there are incredibly low appetite for risk and low willingness to risk, and very few people, going to your flat structures point, feeling able to make decisions about smaller scale points that might actually unlock quite big scale efficiencies at the front line. So how on earth do we explain that conundrum, and what are your views on how do you get a better balance and attitude towards risk in the public sector?
I mean, I won't be nearly as intelligent or insightful as Tim on this, but my view is that if you get the Minister or the Prime Minister involved, then big risks will be taken. But lower down the structure, no one will do anything except follow what the protocol is. And I agree with you that they are looking for organisations that tick a lot of boxes and generally are very hierarchical. But it's completely different if you get the buy-in from the PM and his team or a senior minister, and then they're willing to change the world, for that day at least.
Yeah. Gillian, did you have any thoughts on that? Or?
Just contemplating the risk in pretty much any organisation that I've come across, and particularly I would say in local government as well as central government, the big things aren't the difficult things to take risks with, because they're not fully thought out and they're not all in your face at the time you're taking those decisions. And it's quite sexy to take some big decisions about, we want to change this whole policy area, and someone else will work out the detail. And it was always the thing that, you'd go to your finance committee or something and they'd spend 3 hours talking about 50 quid that was being spent somewhere, because that's the easy thing to get your arms around and actually have a discussion about and think about, this could come back and bite me, as opposed to those bigger things. But I think there's something underneath all of this which is about culture of organisations such as government. And it goes back, I suppose, to the civil service point, which brings about risk aversion. If there's a culture around blame, if there's not a culture around encouraging and incentivising creativity and innovation, and if there's a sort of feeling that if you can just hold your breath and last 5 years, you can kind of go back to square one and start again. So I think there's something underneath all of that, incentivisation, what gets rewarded, what gets managed, about that creativity that sends people into a let's do nothing, let's hold our breath and hope that it will go away.
Nicola or Tim?
I completely agree. But the fundamental paradox of flat management structures is you require incredibly strong dynamic leadership to impose them. Yeah, so it sounds like a contradiction in terms. You think of hierarchy or something top, but actually, if you think, although they've got a lovely public administration, it is completely true that the company with whom I interact the most, with the most impressive creative people across the board, remain Virgin. And somehow, Virgin have created that sort of sense of anarchy whilst becoming a sort of 30-year established company and all the rest of it. Now, admittedly, Richard Branson's secular saint stuff is sometimes overdone. If you worked out how much tax Virgin have paid in the last 30 years, that'd be quite interesting. But anyway, but it does require very, very strong leadership to impose flat management structure, and then to keep flat management structure as an organisation grows. And a fascinating case study at the moment, those who are into these things, is the efforts that the Google founders are making to avoid Google going down the route of IBM as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The temptation to say, we need more layers of management, we need to be organised more like this and less like that, is so powerful. And whether or not Google's here in 20 years' time as the dominant force is now, depends more than anything else on the success or failure of that attempted discipline to maintain flat management structures. Because if they don't do it, then somebody called Boogle or Snoogle or Flugel will come along with a flat management structure and nobble them, just as Google nobbled Yahoo once Yahoo, which ironically, Yahoo stands for yet another hierarchically ordered organisation. That was a sitting joke. Yahoo lost the ability to remain flat and got steamrolled.
I'm going to take a couple more just comments from the floor, actually, if anyone has any comments they're burning to say, and then I'm going to come back to all the panellists for one final thing that they would like government to do in 2015, whoever's elected, your plea to the parties. A few comments. There's one here, one there, and one there. I'm afraid I'm only going to take the ones on this side, I'm afraid, so just three.
So I'm Anise Redding from the Cabinet Office, and I guess I just want to comment on the fact that none of these discussions have really mentioned the new Chief Executive of the Civil Service, who has come into his role partly to make government more effective. And clearly it's not a one-man job. A lot of these questions are really quite complicated, but it is a new role, and precisely because some of these questions kind of keep coming up because they're so difficult, it just feels like any discussion on this topic should probably consider what that new role might mean and what opportunities it might bring as well.
Good point. We have lots of stuff on the Chief Executive of Civil Service on our website, so there's worth having a look at the blogs from Peter Riddle on that, as well as whatever the panel end up saying in their final comments. If we go there to Alan.
Hi, my name's Alan Cogbill. I spent 35 years in Whitehall, so maybe part of the problem. I horribly recognise lots of what you said, but you know, looking with a bit of political realism and things like that, and looking at how things operate, the issue about what government adds is rather important. And my perception, I get shouted down for saying this, was that I actually felt really sorry for ministers, because you had horrible dilemmas, you had competing interests, you couldn't satisfy everybody, and if you attempted a sophisticated approach, the wretched voters went and backed somebody who was simplistic and a snake-oil salesman or woman, and that was the reality, you know. Now, query, I've heard things about flat structures, absolutely agree in delivery terms, but we have structures which deliver things like accountability that we talk about. I think the panel talked about accountability. We have things like regulation of enterprise, actually, because we don't really trust entrepreneurs. We have, you can look at Google or Virgin and all of them, but there, as a customer, I feel a degree of fraudulence about those offerings. They're very commoditized in some cases, or they depend on shed loads of money and low tax in others. And these are not models that I like the look of for things that matter, like social care or health interventions in mental health or something like that. Query, is there anything that people like you, others in this room, can do to shift the whole terms of debate? It doesn't seem to me it's quite enough to say it's only a problem for government. And if we had a good government, good civil service, they would make the market work, like Margaret Hodge said this morning. I mean, I agree, commissioning procurement can be sorted out and made more intelligent, but isn't there a kind of response side somewhere else? And is there something that others could be doing to get onto a better basis?
Very good. And one more comment or question at the back. And please say who you are and where you're from.
I'm Maria Paniatu and I'm in the Home Office. It was a question really, or a comment on the digital revolution and really the sort of public appetite for it. Because I think if we asked anyone, they would say that they would want to be able to have an app to be able to fill in their tax reform, or they want government to become more digital. But then on the other hand, you always have the sort of Daily Mail headline, government spends £10 million on iPads whilst poor postman relies on food bank to be able to eat. But I think the real large problem with digital is that the upfront cost, and whilst it's all great for us to say the government needs to invest lots of money in infrastructure, on the other hand, the public appetite for it might not be there when we're talking about food banks and poverty in general and how people are struggling with the welfare system. I think the real lacking and the sort of fickleness of the public is the problem, especially in things with digital, because of the controversy of it when you have people starving, supposedly.
Very good. Okay, so you can choose to address any of those comments if you like, but I think all of them had an element of comment as well as question in there. So I'll just give you the chance to say some final words on what you think is most important for the 2015 government, whatever colour or colours it comprises.
I'd probably start where I finished my opening remarks, which were I think that we do need a new brand of political leadership that is quite courageous and actually picks up the huge agenda that there is and does demonstrate some leadership around that. I think there's something here about the engagement of people which gets into loads of words and wordsmithing that doesn't actually have any impact to it. But I remember, because I'm sufficiently old, sadly, all sorts of discussions about the management or the union or the this or the that, and the answer back was, well, you are part of that. We're all part of a democracy, we're all part of the politics that we engender, we're all part of the governments that we get. And if we don't crack, and new politics, new political leadership doesn't crack getting a bit more engagement and a bit more representation, therefore, of what the general opinion is, then it is doomed to more of the same, which is not going to work.
Very good.
So I suppose I would like to actually pick up on a couple of points raised about, we don't really want to outsource everything to Google and digital's expensive. And then that's my final point, sort of going back to how I think that you could rework the way government works to make it more like a startup, which I know sounds very far-fetched, but I don't think digital products have to be that expensive. So that's number one. I think there's a different, it's not the old model of government says, okay, we're going to take this problem and spend 2 years building the most super-duper website, and then we'll see if people like it. That's just not the way any startup organisation would build anything. They basically do a very, very, very quick minimum solution and get users involved. And that's the key other thing, I think, is, you're focusing on the product and the outcome and not who's building it and who's doing it. Getting cross-party teams, including the public, involved at a very early stage to test the hypothesis of what you're building and change direction if necessary. These are all, tried and tested ways that, Silicon Valley works. And it's not impossible for big organizations to create small, agile teams within them. There are a number of, case studies of enormous private sector organisations that grapple with exactly this issue, in that they're too hierarchical and they can't get things done. And the projects are too big, and they're used to doing great big project plans and never making any mistakes. And it's the opposite of that, really, to be functional in a digital world. You've got to make small investments and make lots of mistakes and involve users all the way along. So I actually think it's the only way to become more efficient. And I take your point that maybe not all the public wants it, but actually increasingly all the public will be using it, and that's just a fact of life.
Yeah, somewhere we're going through the digital mafia is ganging up on you here. I think it's a very top-down view of digital. Digital actually is incredibly cheap. And the idea that the public aren't up for it, well, then going back to my notion of the personal sector as well as the private sector, public sector, the public has happily transformed the way it operates in the travel sector, the music sector, the media sector, kind of say Mumsnet, so the rest of it. The notion of the public aren't up for it won't wash. But just in case you're right, and because I'm a reasonable person, I'll compromise with you. Let's burn the Daily Mail to the ground anyway. This is sort of, just in case. So I'm there. On the Simon Stevens point, so I'm a huge fan of Simon. After all, he read PPE at Oxford in the 1980s. He must be a genius, if not terribly novel within our public sphere. But no, I mean, he's a fantastic hire. But isn't it so very British and so very government that we reorganise the bloody structure in the NHS first, and then bring in the genius, having more or less tied his hands as to what he's working with, as to how he's supposed to pull off some sort of NHS 2.0. I mean, wouldn't it be better kind of do it the other way round?
Very good. Nicola, any final thoughts?
So I thought I'd just like to end with, we've got about 6 months till the election. It's been a really interesting discussion, but I think we probably made it sound like it's possibly difficult for politicians. So a few things that parties can do between now and the election. So I think that they can prepare. I think ministers can prepare to be a minister individually and think about how they're going to be in government. I think they can prepare with their teams, figure out with their teams what their priorities are, and then actually communicate those to the civil service and let the civil service know what is going to be expected of them.
Very good. So I think I summarised those last comments, and I'm actually very pleased to see what they were, because I think they're all things that the Institute has at different points in time argued in favour of. So obviously, strong and different style of political leadership and public engagement, agile and iterative IT projects, something we wrote about in 2011 in a report called System Error. Obviously thinking about the leadership team and getting that in place before you're trying to drive changes, and then preparation of political and administrative leaders as well. So really gratified to hear some of the themes that we've worked on coming through. I think we've covered hugely ambitious territory today. I hope it's stimulated some thoughts for you about effective government, and I hope we can carry on having this debate not just before the election but probably long after it as well, because these issues aren't going anywhere. Thanks very much.